That's my favourite saying, good trouble. And just thinking how we can shake the system to disrupt it, to make change.
We are there, particularly in, the state sector, we are meant to be serving our most underserved people, and therefore being able to recognise them, allowing them to self-identify, have a voice and have agency, and have some power when it comes to not only, being part of that data collection, but actually seeing what that data collection can do for them. That's the kind of conflicts I really lean into and embrace.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach. In today's episode, we will be speaking with Dr. Nicole Ponsford and Frances Akinde. Founder of the Global Equality Collective, Nicole is an award-winning educator, edtech entrepreneur, and leading voice on inclusion data, whose doctoral research introduced the concept of kaleidoscopic data, a new framework transforming how schools see, hear, and value every learner and educator.
Frances is an educator, speaker, and author of her book, The In-Ally, Not a Bystander. She is passionate about creating inclusive schools where every child feels seen, heard, and valued. She champions allyship and intersectionality, helping educators turn awareness into meaningful action. So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen. So good to see you both, Nic and Frances. We're really excited to have you on the show here.
Thank you for having us.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this conversation because we're exploring things that I think need to matter so much more to so many more of us. We're looking at data and power and data and inclusion, the way in which data can make the world better rather than worse, I guess. I wonder, when you think about data and power, what's the first story or image that comes to mind for you?
For me, it's marginalisation and how data has been used as an excuse to keep marginalised groups down. And especially when we're looking at, my specialism is looking at intersectionality between race and send. So when we're talking about children with special needs, in particular from marginalised groups, data is used as an excuse, really, to not support children to go further. That power part of it is a really important part of the conversation as well.
And do you think the data, or the way that schools have historically used data, pushes the margins further to the fringes then? Is it like a tool of further marginalisation, or simply maintains the problematic status quo?
I would say it's further marginalisation, but also using it as an excuse not to support children to do better. So I was in the school the other day and a school leader said, well, that child isn't double disadvantaged, so he's not going to be our focus at the moment. And I was like, when did that become a thing? At the end of the day, that they are struggling in education, and that's all that matters. So it's kind of using excuses to not support children to fulfill their potential.
I think when I start thinking about data and my story was, I should have been a free school meal child in a state school, which means that opens up funding because of a lack of social capital you've got. And actually, my parents and family didn't want me to sign up for that because there was an amount of shame that it created for the family for your child to line up or give different sort of wristband. And so I wasn't in that data bucket. And what I then realised as I went on to go into education, first as a teacher and school leader, and then now as a doctoral researcher, was that actually the data that we have is unreliable. We aren't actually collecting realistic, reliable data. And that's what we measure and sort of pin all our hopes and our strategies and policies and practice on. And the data's not right in the first place. So for me, one of the things that's become really important is, that nothing about us without us, how we use lived experience then to help us and look at where we can promote power and agency for our people, particularly our most underserved, through using data as a mechanism and making sure we're really, listening to the hidden voices, which is the thing I'm really passionate about, because, without doing that, our data is meaningless in schools.
Nic, you mentioned the data reliability and that essentially that when we think we're seeing one thing, but we may be drawing the wrong conclusions from it. Could you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, I mean, when I've started to look at data, and obviously, part of this is I've had to create a whole data set and a framework, which, I've been able to do, but it made me really kind of drill into the kind of why of data, the history of data, how we collect it, why we collect it, who creates it, what we do with it after it. And I think once you start to, shake the tree, you start to realise that actually what we've used historically, and a lot of the data sets that we use in education come from the 1960s. And if you think the first through education system was established in 1944, we're essentially using a lot of the same data that we used right at the start of traditional schooling, and that doesn't sit well, I think, in terms of contemporary and modern schooling. So part of it is understanding, what are we trying to collect? Why are we trying to collect it? And what are we going to do after it? And I think it's very timely now, thinking about it with, the background of AI. It's really helping data researchers try to understand how we can use technology for data in a way that isn't just based on sort of effectiveness, which is essentially what AI is done, but it's done on actually humanising data that we've not been able to do before. So I think we're in a really interesting place when we're starting to think about data and, what it is, what kind of intelligence we're trying to collect and how that can help us provide a better solution and service for our young people.
I was just going to come in then just to, go further on Nick's point around that, because in order to use data, the baseline data has to be sound. And this is what I'm finding, that sometimes schools will run away with themselves around data because they've gone down like a rabbit hole of something, but they haven't made sure that the baseline data is sound. Especially I was looking at analysing who gets EHCPs, looking at data to see that. But then if the DFE data isn't picking up what we need it to pick up, and then everybody's running away with that and saying, well, our children in schools, it's 14%, send. It's not. It's actually around 24% because they're not analysing the right kind of data to show us that information. So I spend a lot of time saying to schools, look at your baseline data, make sure that's right. And we know sometimes AI hallucinates as well, because when I've been looking at data and I say, where have you got this from? Oh, well, I made it up. I'm like, well, that's not helpful to me. Like, what are you doing? I'm trying to present this data. That's how I chat to my mate, Copilot. Anyway, but yeah.
So just for the international audience of the podcast, an EHCP is an education, health and care plan. So It's intended to be a mechanism through which those kids who need greater or different support are able to access it. But inevitably it becomes something of a political football, and it's in a process of mutation at the moment in the UK as well. Nic, sorry, were you going to say something else there?
Yeah, just, where we've got these equity gaps with traditional static data that we collect, AI and technology, when you run that through an MIS system, it just makes those equity gaps even bigger, because what it's doing is it's taken the data that it's got and then it's sort of pushing it to its limits. So where traditional data sets might miss out things like intersectional needs that aren't being picked up, or the data's being collected in a way where people aren't authentic or, feel that they are safe to give that information, it only makes that, it might be easier to read. It doesn't actually help with reliability of that data or creates data for inclusion, as it's called.
I'm curious about some of this. So going back to your words about the baseline and getting the baseline right, Frances, and without an accurate baseline, then everything else is going to be slightly skewed further down the road. And you're talking there about reliability as well, Nic, in data. And I wonder sometimes whether, the very baseline we want to be accurate, is that baseline not potentially a source of marginalization? The ways in which we measure, the things we're expected to include in that baseline, is that not part of the problem? And also, when we're looking for reliability or accuracy, is there not an extent to which so many of the ways that we're expected within governmental systems to use and instrumentalize data is really quite reductive? And therefore, what does it mean to be reliable or accurate when you're using a data set which in itself reduces kids and removes from them the complexity that they have? So there's a simple question for you both. Come back to the baseline. Coming back to the baseline first of all, is there an issue with the baseline first?
Yeah, I mean, what's that saying? A foolish man builds his house upon the sand. I remember it as a song from when I was a kid. But it is that foundation. Let's start from observations in classrooms. We're expecting teachers to tell us, particularly when I'm talking about SEND and inclusion, we're expecting teachers to tell us those pupils that they've kind of picked out or noticed are having difficulties that may not have a pre-existing diagnosis of SEN needs, of special needs. And then from that information, that goes to the SENCO, and the SENCO says, okay, this child may have a need and I'm going to explore this further. I'm not looking at this child or whatever. So immediately you've got that bias in place and who gets noticed and who doesn't. And then when the school completes their census to say, okay, these are the amount of children that we've got with SEN needs and these are what these needs look like, who is being picked up on the SEN register and why? Why are we including certain kids in the register to say they need support with their needs, and why are we excluding some? So then a school's data will go forward to the DFE to say, well, you've got 16% SEN in your school. This is what your data is telling us. But actually, they haven't done the analysis or the assessment properly in the first place to say, no, actually, it's this percentage. So exactly that example, I was in a school the other day doing training, and the information data system that Ofsted use and the DFE use to look at their school was giving different percentages to what the school were telling me their SEN data was. And I was like, but that's what you've reported on your census. So then it took all those steps for them to kind of say, oh, we haven't got this right. And that's too late. And that has, bigger consequences. So we really need to teach people in the classroom how to use their data and why data is important. And we don't do enough of that.
And the tendrils of that bias, the roots of that bias go really, really deep, right?
Absolutely.
But even that baseline, if we talk about power and power hoarding and power redistribution, if the composition, the content of that baseline has been decided by the very same people who have always held the power in the society in which that baseline is expected to live and breathe, then there's a problem there, isn't there, in terms of the creation of that baseline? What do you think about that, Nic?
Yeah, hugely. And I was really fortunate, I made myself look at data in a completely different way and have done over the last 6 years. And part of the work that I've done with the GEC was because there weren't real world solutions out there. So I'm quite determined and I've doggedly gone out and done it. But yeah, I mean, if you take it in terms of academic research, there are elements like data feminism, queer data, street data, which you introduced me to, I think 4 years through my doctorate. There are marginalized groups who are looking at the impact of data on them and how it's serving them or not serving them would be the first point. So if you actually look at critical data studies, this is an area that, researchers are out there, there's books written about it. But in education, we don't have that understanding of data. We don't have data literacy. We don't have data maturity models. And, when you look at research in terms of understanding children and children's voice. There's something called the mosaic approach, and that includes observations, the children's voice, professionals around them, and it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data. Now, what we tend to do in schools is we use almost like running in parallel with what we're getting across with AI about, is that it's kind of automated and it's efficient, but it takes out the humanity of what we want to look at. And so, but that's what we've done. We look at what's happened, who has turned up today, what grade did they get, where do we assess them to be? But actually, there's a lot of things missing. Teachers are not trained in not just, in neurodiversity worldwide. There are different elements. Wales does like an hour a year, etc. But teachers aren't trained in child development. They're not clinical psychologists. So the idea that a teacher in a modern classroom, even if you take all their privilege out of it, they don't have that training, so they cannot diagnose. And when we think of our data models, particularly around things around mental health and neurodiversity, which essentially need a medical model, which, in England, the wait times are ridiculous, years and years we're waiting. So we've got this kind of messy approach to understanding what a child's doing and how we can support them and how we then measure that in the data, because a lot of the systems around aren't working, aren't reliable and aren't consistent. So when we're thinking then about power and agency, and we're thinking about what is a SEND child, that is determined on someone, and we don't know what phobic beliefs they've got. We don't know what their understanding is. We don't know if they can really understand what's going on for that child or that family. And so, of course, it's going to be flawed. Of course, young people are going to get missed. And that's why when you start to get into this area, it feels like, it's really actually very messy. And that's what social sciences are about. It's very messy. And then, you get a headache and then you just want to go and sit in a really dark room for a while because it's just too hard to kind of work out. And, I get that. But actually starting to have very honest conversations about, what's important for our young people. And I know I initially met Matthew and Paul at the Data for Schools conference, which was data and wellbeing. And the people in the room were asked, what's really important with data? And everyone said, wellbeing, yay, confetti guns. Actually, how much time do you spend looking at wellbeing? Actually, no, we look at performative data and we look at attendance. And that's what we're getting. We're getting that missed part about what that experience is like, why that child is not coming into school. Does that child have a trusted adult? Does that child feel safe? Does that child feel they can achieve and belong and thrive, and all the words we're hearing Ofsted are bringing in this country? And how do we measure it? Well, we go to our data. And essentially, a lot of the data we get is quantitative rather than qualitative. So we don't get the narratives and the lovely, rich storytelling that we should around. And therefore, when we come back to it, that initial benchline data, which is quantitative based on, kids all sitting in the same room and getting a test, or, the last teacher's view of what that child is, it is going to be flawed. So we either have to improve the data or we have to get better at challenging what that data is, I think.
Or a mixture of both.
That's it.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
There's so many great threads in that conversation, and I just want to see if I can pick out a couple of them. One of them is thinking about the technology that we're using in order to capture data, and how a lot of the data that we've been looking at is what was easy to capture 30, 40 years ago. And now we have the capability to capture different kinds of data that can potentially align better with the things that we care about. Another one is those power structures where the people who have been looking at these specific forms of data that were easy to capture 30, 40 years ago, it's reinforced that these are the things that matter now, because it's just the way things have been. It's the way that they grew up with it. It worked for them. And if there are people for whom it didn't work, they may be on the outskirts of that conversation. And so those voices are now starting to challenge that narrative. And then another thread that I'm hearing in this is that the details really matter. Like, we may think we're trying to do the right thing, but if we're not actually implementing it the way that we're intending to be implementing it, we may end up with a very different outcome than we had hoped for in the beginning. Is that, some of those strands, do those resonate as some of the key pieces in this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to say that we tend to use data to back up our own beliefs and dismiss the data that doesn't fit. So, if we have this narrative that, or I don't know, like let's say, for example, the narrative around Black Caribbean boys and the high rates of exclusion and the high rates of social, emotional, mental health difficulties. No one's actually analysing the data to look at those underlying needs. And if we did that analysis and that assessment to say, okay, this looks like SEMH, but it's speech and language, it's other forms of neurodiversity like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, then our data would be different because it would be showing higher rates of autism and ADHD and everything else. But because the narrative is that, they are more likely to have SEMH needs, that's what we're looking at. And we say there's higher rates of exclusion around that. So I think that's a really important example of what we're seeing going on around the narrative and how data is used to enforce our own positions about things.
One of the things that we've not been able to do with the technology, and therefore we've not been able to capture it, is look at that intersectional data. So you're looking at different lived experience. So when I had the opportunity to kind of like challenge in my head what data was as a teacher and think about how I could hook it onto something else, I went for the Equality Act. So I went for the 9 protected characteristics of the Equality Act. But I also knew for me, and the conversations I was being pulled in, which were about being female in technology, actually, when I self-identify, probably being female is third down my list of what I think about when I would describe myself. And so that intersectional lived experience has always been very important to me, and to my family and to my friends. And I have always seen inclusion as a lens rather than a policy, I suppose. So then looking at data, I wanted to have a data for inclusion, which was a lens. And so the demographics that I collect about 60 different demographics for staff and students with the kaleidoscopic data that I've created. And so what happens then when I am looking at what that data is telling us, I can look at that in terms of lived care experience or migration or menopause or different neuro minority identities, and look at that compared with those that have not. So we've now launched the Inclusion Index, which the next one goes live on Monday the 3rd of November. And in that, we've looked at things like kids saying that they've missed school because of who they are. And in that, global majority students rag that safety and representation is linked to their disengagement, that students who are eligible in their own mind, they've self-identified their socioeconomic status, this hasn't been done by the teachers, that they report that they are barriers that are twice as much as their peers who aren't, from that socioeconomic status. So I've been able to create that technology with the participants, with schools, with students, etc. And I'm starting to see that data. And I suppose then the challenge is, if we can do this, I've proved we could do this, hundreds of schools. Where does this take us? Like, what is the next step? How do we start to challenge what data means in schools? And are we going to have it based around well-being and lived experience, or are we going to stick to traditional measures such as attendance and performative grades? What matters to leaders essentially the most these days, because the technology is now there to do it, I think.
I wondered, Nick, I'm a card-carrying fan of kaleidoscopic data and I love it, but to many of the global audience to this podcast, it might be new. I'm wondering whether you can share some of the appetite there has been for it and some of the impact that it's starting to have in some schools beyond the UK. Because I recognise in this conversation here, three of us are very much steeped in and rooted in the UK, but the audience for this podcast is far more global. How does kaleidoscopic data work within that global ecosystem, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it kind of has accidentally happened. So I was looking for a framework to help schools surface up the hidden voices, but also with my work as like a school leader and a coach as well, I knew we needed a report and support model for it. So I didn't want to just create the data, because that doesn't actually help with inclusion. You need to know how to kind of close the gaps next. So two things really happened. Firstly, I wanted to find out what the, how do schools look at inclusion now? So I mapped out the field and I looked at the consultancy model we have in schools, the consultancy models that the government have brought in, where funding goes when it comes to inclusion and where it doesn't go. And I looked at who the experts were in the space, who were passionate about it, who had experience, so academics, authors, grassroots organisations, the ones that actually school leaders tend to go to for inclusion rather than if they don't have a lived experience themselves. So that was the start of something which is called the Global Equality Collective. And we've now got a huge circle of experts, we're 400 strong, and they personify and work in all the different areas around the Equality Act, intersectionally, different age phases all around the world. So that's the GEC circle. The second part of the GEC is the GEC platform, and that's based on the kaleidoscopic data, which it took me 6 years of researching to come up with a name because I didn't know what to call it. And essentially what that kaleidoscopic data does, it collects information about the school experience for staff and students. And I've just moved to the third leg of the stool and I'm looking at parent and carer voice in schools. And it looks at it through that very messy, multidimensional, ever-changing, fluid dynamic that is the lived experience. So all of the data, all of the questions around school culture and school climate are then basically intersected with the Equality Act and our lived experience outside of that as well. And so schools get an index which illustrates who feels what, and it surfaces up the smallest marginalised groups in a way that we don't normally get in education, because we normally get the big headlines. We don't get to see the small groups and we don't identify those small groups. So that's what I've done. And then the platform that I've designed for school leaders and trust leaders means that they can get this in their context, because I think inclusion is context based. It's nice seeing national and international headlines, but actually it's about the people in the building normally. And so I started that as a research model, and basically accidentally became a bit successful. So now we've got about 400 schools across, I think we're just over 30 countries using it. And I've surveyed 26,000 staff and students, and that number keeps increasing. So what I'm trying to do, because academic theses are quite impenetrable to read, I'm trying to share that intelligence as much as I can. So on the website, which I'm sure we'll share, we've got not only the reports, which is an English and media teacher's version of a cool thesis, and also because I can, each term I'm going into that data and triangulating that with, the conversations I'm having, what the schools are telling us around the world, what are the inclusion barriers, like the top 10 behaviours around that for staff and students. And we call that the inclusion index. So we did one. It was very successful. So we're now just about to launch the October one. And because I can go into that live data, I don't have to wait a year like the DfE or governments. I can go into it whenever I want. So each term, I'm going to pull out that data and to show everyone what we're seeing, and hopefully that will be of help. So that's what we're doing, and I hope that describes it. But the reason I called it kaleidoscopic data was I don't think people should be looked at in in one lens, and part of a problem we've got is not all the shapes fit, but with a kaleidoscope they do, and so that's what I was aiming for, Matthew.
And that's great. And you're looking at we're looking at specific positive change as a result of data, as opposed to data being this prison and this kind of tyranny. I wonder, Frances, you've worked across leadership, SEND, anti-racism. Can you give us a couple of examples of where you've started to see data make those marginalized identities more visible, rather than that reductiveness that has pushed them further to the edges? What's the positive ways forward that you're starting to see in schools?
So I always speak to schools about looking at data through an equitable lens. And sometimes I might be the first person that's had that conversation with them around intersectionality. It's always missing from the conversation. And I actually did a book chapter. It's called Beyond Boundaries, the book, and it's looking at kind of trust and leadership level inclusion. And I did a chapter on there around looking at data through an equitable lens, because I realized people didn't know how to do it. They were just making assumptions around the data that they were given and not analysing it a bit more. So, for example, I'm a coach on the Leeds Beckett Anti-Racist Schools Award, and I ask about a school's send data, and they present the overall data, but then I say to them, okay, what does that look like in terms of percentages for marginalised groups? What does that look like in terms of your overall school figures, and then your amount of children that are getting SEN support or going through to get a diagnosis or, an EHCP, educational healthcare plan? And they often look at me and say, oh, we never thought about that. We never thought about doing that. So my job is in a very public way to just show people how to do it, and not say, okay, you need to hire me to come in. And because there is a lot of money being made around kind of consultants going in and saying, this is how you do it. So it's so important to have open ways to say to people, especially schools can't afford that, to say, this is how you analyze your data. This is what it looks like. And so using platforms like the GEC platform, and me just putting things out there publicly to say, this is how you do it, is helping schools to look at their data, because sometimes they don't want to admit that they're not getting it right, and they don't want to ask for help. But if you produce something and say, look, this will help you to do it, then they're happy. So this is what I've found, that schools are more engaged in that, because they're having, we're helping them to have those conversations and giving them the starting points.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
One of the things that both of you are doing in your work is helping unravel some of the complexity that are our students, and all of the different nuances of ways that people can be either have their needs being met or not being met. But I'm wondering in the back of my mind, like, is there a tension between that complexifying of things and some of the very reductive types of decision making that at some point gets made, like which students get what services? Where for an administrator, they want to see that line, like if it's over 20% on this score or this metric, whatever, then we're going to give them services, or vice versa. If they're under 20%, we're going to give them services. If not, it feels like in education, we want to be. I mean, our mission is to serve every child. That's what inclusion means, to make sure everybody's needs are being met. But we're also all struggling in this world of finite resources, where we have to make hard decisions at times about where do we invest those limited resources. How are you thinking about and approaching some of those tough decisions?
Do you want to go, Nic, or shall I?
Yeah.
Because I've got loads to say about this.
I'll go first, and then you. So I think part of the problem that there has been conflict before. That's the whole problem. That actually, although it's been nice and neat and having identifiable data is great, and look what we've all done, and these kids go on to do great things. But this send bunch, which is just like this messy bolt on in the corner, they're a massive problem. And actually, that's kind of, particularly I think in the state sector, and I think sometimes in some areas internationally that I'm seeing around, either through what's going on in the States with Trump and the administration, or the focus in the Middle East around disability in particular due to, one of the royal families. I think part of the problem is actually the conflict has been on the underserved side. So I think if you're surfacing up the hidden voices, and that creates conflict, I'm going to say a good trouble, Frances, just to lead you in. But I think that is, that's a good conflict. We want that conflict. We are there, particularly in, the state sector. We are meant to be serving our most underserved people, and therefore being able to recognise them, allowing them to self-identify, have a voice and have agency, and have some power when it comes to not only, being part of that data collection, but actually seeing what that data collection could do for them. That's the kind of conflicts I really lean into and embrace.
Yeah, Nic knows that that's my favourite saying, good trouble, and just thinking how we can shake the system to disrupt it, to make change. And I was really fortunate. Back in May, I went over to New York, and I was looking at send and inclusion and what that looked like in New York schools, and kind of looking at, from a Department of Education level, what that analysis looks like for children in SEND. And it was a completely different model to the way that we do it in the UK. So as Nic said before, when we're looking at that medical model, we're looking at, okay, we have to wait for a diagnosis, we have to wait for support, we have to wait for this and wait for that. What I really liked about what I saw in New York is they were like, why would you question like taking parents and carers to court to fight for the needs of their children? The approach was much more around, okay, we've identified this need, we need to put things in place. This is the pot of money, whatever that comes from a central level, looking at that data, looking at how children are getting on and analysing that on a regular level. So I got so excited by their data sheets and that accountability to say, okay, our data's showing us that, these children are not doing as well as they should. So what are we doing about it? And I think in the UK, we've moved away from that data analysis in that way because we said it's too heavy for teachers. But I really liked that inclusion in the sense that, in New York, they were looking at things on a really fine level, and like looking at the peaks to say, okay, this child's data has gone down this time. What is it that we can do? And I think because we're so scared in the UK to do that on that level, we're not doing it as much as we should. So I'm kind of more leaning to the American model around it, because what I learnt in New York is Trump doesn't really affect them. They were like saying, we make so much money. Like if he said he's going to take the money away from us, it's not going to make a difference. We still need to get on with what we're doing. So I like that kind of good trouble where they're saying, yeah, we're just getting on with it. And this is what is needed for our children and young people. So, but in the UK, we're much more controlled in the way that we're doing things, so we can't really step out and say, right, we're going to do something a bit different. It doesn't work like that. So, and I wish it did a little bit.
And we're channeling the words of John Lewis there, right? The necessity that we get in the way, the necessity that we get in good trouble and necessary trouble, etc. But I wonder, if I look at schools across the world, there are still a vast majority of schools who are doing things with data exactly as they were done 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, who are doing things with data that, whilst unintentionally so, one could easily see eugenicist tones in this, ascribing and proffering certain value more or less to different people. And so how can we make more of that good necessary trouble such that the pace of change in terms of how data is instrumentalized in schools gets faster? Because it seems to me, looking back over the last few decades, that particular part of education, sure, there are many other ways which are moving in, light speed, but that still seems to me stuck in the ranking mechanism of 50, 60, 70 years ago. So how do we speed up that change? How do we make the good necessary trouble in the right places to make that change happen on a global scale?
We need a revolution. Over to you, Nic.
I'm trying. Well, we've got the inclusion revolution that we're both leading on, haven't we, Frances? So
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I have seen, and I'm gonna go forwards and backwards in this as well. One of the things that I've seen now, I've sort of become a data scientist, is I am now being asked to talk at data events. But the data managers that are around me are dealing with the data, the traditional data. So they're dealing with, assessments and exams, or they're looking at, whole school data, which is like your mapping data. So your higher level, across the board, or your satellite data. So like your subjects within a school. So that's the data that they're looking at. They're not looking at a third level of data, which is what my kaleidoscopic data is, which is that around inclusion. And actually, I think when you stay in that inclusion space, we all know that that inclusion is around social capital. It's around relationships. It's around connections. It's about unlocking opportunities and supporting social mobility and social justice. So we know that that's the kind of messy part of it. So for me, the leaders that come to me, I get IT managers, I get data managers, I get inclusion leads, EDI leads, Senko leads, head teachers, because actually the responsibility for inclusion and data look very, very different in different schools, Matthew, as you well know. And we know that some schools are leaps and bounds, and they can be state, independent or international, leaps and bounds where they're using AI and it's all part of it and everyone's, all shiny and it's great. But actually, what I think we need are actually a data for inclusion managers, because I think that's the difference. I think the data that's being used traditionally, we do need that identifiable, data. We do need like the grades, that kind of thing. But we also now need to humanize that data, and we need managers and leaders and champions that do that. And I think that's the thing that would speed up this process, because otherwise it will just continue to get siloed by people who are fantastic at their jobs. But this is not that job. This is a different job, I think. So that would be my suggestion.
And there is exciting movement, right? I mean, within ECIS internationally, there's some exciting work being done around humanizing pedagogy. If you look at the assessment and data work coming out of Melbourne Metrics, with which the Council of International Schools are now engaging in a really deep and intentional way, that's again more holistic. It's moving away from the performative. So there is a humanizing momentum, I suppose. But I wonder sometimes, is there something? I don't want to get too abstract here, but like we talked about mess a lot in this conversation. Things are messy. There's lots of mess. It's a messy topic. It's a messy subject. And yet the more reductive ways of using data that are more entrenched, they are tidy, right? They make things look ordered. They make things look tidy. They give us the illusion of tidiness. Is there something in our role as educators and school leaders that we don't like, or as humans maybe, I don't know, we don't like the mess, right? We don't like things to be messy, so we can either counter that mess by actually doing the difficult work, digging around in that mess to try and tidy it up, or we can look to a way of measurement that gives the illusion of tidiness. So is there something in that, like the courage and the patience and the time, to wrestle with the difficult stuff, as opposed to retreating to the comfort and the greater efficiency of doing things in a more ordered way?
I think so. I think there's a part that there's a part where when I look at this, I've been asked recently to like sum up what I do in a sentence, like, for a talk or, writing a book or whatever. What, like in one phrase, Nic, what do you do? And I found it really hard because I can talk about loads of different things because of the way that I do my research and the things I get back. And I realised that I'm something called a generalist. And actually, that's what we want our data to do. We want our data to be able to tell the stories of what's going on in school, albeit who's done well in an English test, to who's turned up on what day, to, are they going to miss school in the future? Do the books, look like their family, et cetera, et cetera. So we want our data to be messy, to be generous, because that is what it means to be human. And I think once we sort of take that in and do a sign, go, okay, that's just how it needs to be now. I think that will just throw the gates open to welcoming in that kind of shared power, that equity, that voice that we've lacked, which has created that conflict, I think, as well. We just like a title and an acronym in education. And once we've got that, we know what tracks to go in, I think. Frances, what would you say?
I was going to say, going back a year ago now, I started a postgrad in education and social justice, and it's ruined me because before that I was a head teacher, I was a local authority advisor and inspector. I was very much like, this is the way the education system needs to be. And now, since doing this course, I'm questioning more and more why we're not taking a more child-centered approach around things, and why we don't like mess, but we like money, and we like, our schools have become a way to make money when they should never have been like that in the first place. So we use our data to kind of help us to think about how we can make money and how we can reduce the spend on money. So when we're looking at, identifying children that need support, we under-identify so we don't have to spend the money. That's the incentive, And when we're thinking about our data measures, when we're thinking about Progress 8 data and things like that, we know that if schools don't get good results, they don't attract, the right kind of families, and then, they don't have so much money coming in. That's what it all comes down to now. So I'm in danger now of every conversation I have having a rant about capitalism, but it's like, it's so damaging in terms of what we're seeing in education, that we are not taking this child-centered approach. What is it that children need, rather than how can we make money out of education?
And I love that. You're conceptualizing data as the broken and blunt tool of late stage capitalism, and
Absolutely.
we need to retrieve it and rescue it from that fate.
Definitely, I'm going to write that down as another one of your sayings. Yes, data is the blunt tool of capitalism. Oh my gosh, that's it.
For some of our listeners who are in the classroom, people who are in that, on the front line with this, what are some of these more high level or systemic ideas about data and inclusion and helping reach all of those kids who need our support? What are some of the implications for them based on the work that you've done?
The thing is, I like about Nic's platform is around using data for good. And that's how we should be thinking about data. And especially when we're talking about children, how can we use data to help us do the best for our children and young people? And I think that's what, when we're looking at our data on a school level, that's what we need to look at. If on a school level, you've identified that, absent rates are high, and then when you analyze it, you see that it's a lot of children with, autism or something else like that. That's where data is used for good, for you to be able to come back and say, okay, we need to do something differently so these children are included. So to me, when we're looking at the reforms in the UK and thinking about how we can use data, it should be about how we use data for good to help us support our most marginalized children and young people. I don't know what theory that comes under, but maybe it's mine. I don't know.
To all the classroom teachers, as Paul says, those at the chalk face in schools around the world who are listening to this podcast, who are listening to these ideas and finding themselves crying out, saying, yes, I agree, I believe in that, that's the future. And then they're in their classroom the next day. What can they do differently with the limited or restricted power that they have to influence systemic change? What can they do differently, inspired by what you guys are talking about today, to make that positive change?
How can they use data for good?
Yeah.
You know, what is the problem that they see in their classrooms? What is the problem that they want to solve? And how can they use data to do that? And that's the first fundamental question in the classroom. And it's not necessarily around, which children aren't making progress, which children aren't happy, which children can you see aren't coming into schools, and how can you use that in your own analysis? Sometimes it's just about having somebody else in your classroom so you can sit back and observe what's going on in your classroom. And this is why I say, when you're lucky enough to have a teaching assistant in your class, use them as your eyes to tell you what's going on. That's kind of like a data study in itself, to say, this is what I've observed and this is what I'm going to do about it. So yeah, to me, exactly like you said, Paul, thinking about how we can use our own observations and use data to back up what we see, but also in the opposite of that, where sometimes we're making assumptions around what's going on in our classrooms, and actually data helps us to show that it's not the way that we imagined, and that's really important as well.
Anything you'd add to that, Nic?
Yeah, I think the first thing you can do is think about, when someone says data to you, what does that mean? And think then about how you contribute to that data, and then what data you would actually like to see. I think it's quite powerful to think about where data and your students, they're passive. So where the data is being done to them, and where they can maybe have more of a voice and agency. So that might mean actually challenging the data collection that you've got to give day to day, and starting to think about how you can use data for storytelling, which is produced by them, created by them. And that can even be as simple as thinking about conversations with your leaders around how you do surveys, for example. Where have they come from? What are they doing with it? How does it happen? Do the kids consent to it? And then I think at a higher level, yeah, if you want to do something, come and help me, because I'm trying to disrupt it. And, have a look at how you can look at self-identified data maybe in a new way in your organisation. Because I think we will look back on these discussions around data in like 25 years and just will recognise it as that blunt tool, as we know, and be wanting the data to really help us, measure what we value and not value what we measure. So I would be in your individual classrooms or departments or schools, just starting those conversations about how can we use data for inclusion in a way that actually serves our young people.
And I wonder if we can then bring this together as we reach the end of this conversation, a conversation which could go on for hours and we still could go on for yet more. If we think forward to that 20, 25 years time, right? Let's imagine by then data is a force for good. Let's imagine by then data in schools is absolutely healing, nurturing and nourishing and protecting our children. What do we know then that we wish we had known back in 2025?
I think we know it already, that the way schools are is not fit for purpose for all our children. And I think it will literally be not even 25 years, 2 years time, probably, where all children have got trackers that tells us all their mood throughout the day and their peak learning times, and, when the best time is for them to do homework and eat and everything else like that. And we'll be using all this data to tell us, okay, let's not give them English first thing in the morning. Let's give them a bit more sport or a bit more playtime and things like that. And I think we're seeing that happen already in terms of that kind of data tracking. Which worries me a lot in some senses. But at the same time, if we can use it to get a better analysis of our children and young people and what they need, then that would be fantastic.
Okay, because you said the risks there are reducing as well, aren't they? Reducing in a different way, but reducing to number, whereas we want it to remain expansive. So it's that tricky balance, isn't it, with all that AI could provide for us. What about you, Nic? If we've solved this problem of data harm and data tyranny, if you like, in years to come, what is it that we knew then that we wish we'd known now?
I think we would recognise that data is a dialogue, which is what we're not at the moment, and it is messy, and we're allowed to kind of go in and out of it. I think we'd also really be able to personalise the school experience or a schooling experience for our young people as well, and therefore learn the different ways we can make it work, and maybe even take more risks that are child-centred to make sure we do it in a way that suits that child at that time for them. That again, the education isn't static. So, our data won't be static, nor will a schooling experience be static and fixed either. That's where I'd like us to get to.
I feel like that's a great place for this conversation to come to a close. Thank you both so much for your time. Really enjoyed talking with all of you.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you, both of you. It's been an awesome conversation.
Thank you.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.